Okay, so let me introduce myself. I'm Hallie Gomez. I work at Park Road Books. I'm the events coordinator, and we are so thrilled to have Nick Ochsner on the left, James Ford in the middle, and Michael Graff on the right, discussing Nick and Mike's book, The Vote Collectors. So as Nick said, we have copies at Park Road Books, signed copies. We are happy to hold some for you or ship them for you. But first, we want to hear them talk about it. We want to hear their process. We want to hear the whole story behind the vote collectors. So before we get started, I just have to kind of go over the rules just a little bit. I just want to remind everybody that Park Road Books has a zero tolerance policy in regard to harassment. And by attending this virtual event, you are agreeing to our code of conduct. If you violate this, we can ban you, expel you from this and ban you from any other virtual event. But I know that that is not going to happen, and that's never happened. So we will be totally fine. Now, I want to go ahead and introduce the three people tonight, because I know that you want to hear them speak and not me. So let me go over their bios real quick. So we have on the right, Michael Graff is a writer and editor in Charlotte, North Carolina, with work published in The Guardian, ESPN, Garden and Gun, The Oxford American, Politico, and more. He is the editor of Axios Charlotte. Nick Ochsner on the right is chief investigative reporter at WBTV in Charlotte, North Carolina. And that's it, nothing more. No big research, I know.
What else do you need? What else do you need?
Got Emmys.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Yeah. Enough said. And their moderator tonight is James E. Ford. He's an award-winning educator and consultant on the issues of equality in education. He is the executive director of the Center for Racial Equality in Education, CREED, and the principal consultant at Filling the Gap Educational Consultants. He also serves as an at-large member of the North Carolina State Board of Education. James is the 2014-2015 North Carolina Teacher of the Year and former high school social studies teacher in Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools. He writes and speaks extensively on the issues of educational equality, systemic racism, and economic mobility. Now I am going to turn it over to you guys. Remember, if anybody has any questions, put them in the Q&A and they will get to them at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Holly. I want to preface by saying I hate bios. Anyway, so who cares? You know, about
I need to get your bio writer. Can I do that?
Like I'll give you a couple lines. Brought the Emmy. Fair trade.
We can do that.
Well, welcome to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Excited to be able to discuss this amazing book, The Vote Collectors, the true story of the scammers, politicians, and preachers behind the nation's greatest election fraud. Particularly interested in the subtitle, Scammers, Politicians, and Preachers. I'm going to ask if there's a difference between those three. Also, with a disclaimer that this can be a very casual conversation. If you're looking for formality, you're probably not going to get it. You're going to see bantering among three individuals who, this is pretty much, I think we talk. And so this is really going to be a conversation about this book. And I want to begin by allowing Michael Graff and Nick Ochsner to tell me and the rest of everyone viewing kind of the origin story. You all, my understanding is, didn't set out to write a book. You all didn't say, hey, what you doing? Let's write a book. There's a truly organic and emergent origin story to this text, right? So tell us about how that happened.
I'm a TV reporter. I don't know anything about writing a book. So I needed to write it with Michael Graff here, who's a beautiful magazine writer. But we both started approaching what happened in Bladen County in 2018 in the 9th Congressional District. Think to the yesteryears before COVID, and a congressional race was not certified by the State Board of Elections because there are allegations, the State Board said, that there could have been fraud that could have upended the election. It was less than 1,000 votes, just over 900 in the race between Republican Mark Harris and Democrat Dan McCready. Mark Harris was ahead by just over 900 votes. And the State Board said there might be fraud, let's investigate. And so began the story of the 9th Congressional District scandal. And I actually didn't want to cover the race or the scandal. I'm from Hope Mills, North Carolina, 30 minutes down the road from Bladen County, the closest point of civilization you can get to Bladen County. And I grew up in this area, and you always heard rumors and speculation about shenanigans going on in elections. And so it wasn't new that here we were in 2018 with more speculation about shenanigans in politics and elections. And so I didn't do that. I tried to avoid doing the story. I didn't touch it. I had a lot of other things going on. And then one day I was in Raleigh. I had a big expose airing about something totally unrelated, and no one paid attention to that story. Not, like as a reporter, and Mike knows because he makes internet now for a living. You probably know too, James, that you send out a tweet and you think it's going to be a big deal, and then no one likes it, and no one retweets it, and that was the sort of this big expose. So I was staying in Raleigh with my mom, and I said, well, crap, I gotta go, because everyone was talking about Bladen County. So I said, I gotta go to Bladen County tomorrow. I don't know what I'm gonna get, but I told my bosses I'm going to Bladen County, and I ran into Mike, and I'll let him explain the rest.
I was down there working on a story for Politico, so I was a freelance writer at the time, working for myself. And my motivation to go to Bladen County was somebody said that they're going to pay me to go to Bladen County, and so I went there. Politico said, "Why don't you go write a feature and sort of take the 10,000-foot view on this? Don't go trying to report daily news. Let's write a story about a week later that really tells, puts this in perspective. What does this mean for North Carolina?" And I, like Nick, I had worked in Fayetteville and 30 minutes down the road from Bladen County. And Nick likes to tell the story. Nick was in high school when I was working at the Fayetteville Observer.
Right down the street.
So we were within the same zip code, but at various different ages in our lives, I would say. But I also heard those rumors and just kind of thought, okay, here we go again, just another bunch of unfounded rumors of fraud. But then I go down there and you start talking to people and you just find out, wow, okay, this is going to be a crazy story. So I published the story that weekend. I met Nick while I was down there. I ran into him at the steps of the Elizabethtown courthouse. He had a big TV camera with him, and I do what I do. I was trying to stay away from all the TV cameras and try to be a fly on the wall. Hope nobody notices I'm there. Basically, Nick stands out like a sore thumb everywhere he goes with cameras and lights and everything with him. So I just went up to him and said, it's good to see you here. We should catch up when we get back to Charlotte. Little did we know, 3 months later, we'd be working on a book together. Nick had access to the most pivotal character in the story, McCrae Dallas. No other reporter in the state had that. Nick knew that access was wild, that there were things going on with McCrae and his circle of people that were just too good to not tell. But at the time, McCrae was a confidential source for Nick, and he didn't want to have his story told at the time. And so we just kind of waited, and we said, all right, well, can we wait for a book? And McCrae said, yeah. And next thing I know, I was invited in to come to this crazy world and met McCrae Dallas. I never interviewed him without a tape recorder. Nick and I were trying to check each other throughout the process of the book. So Nick regularly gets calls from McCrae. I didn't want to talk to him unless it was a very standard formal setting so that we could check each other and make sure that, our book was going to rise above all of the questions that would come from how did you get this close to McCrae or things like that. So, we worked together throughout the process like that.
Really interesting. So both of y'all were on assignment essentially,
Mhm.
right? You as a broadcast journalist, right? You as a freelance print journal, right?
Yeah.
Going there and trying to cover the piece. And it was a story that was huge, right? I mean, in hindsight, it's kind of too big to pass up, right? Lots of awards have been won, right? As a result of this. And local media really got a lot of love and a lot of highlight for that. But you found it was bigger than just a particular written piece or a particular, continuing story, that there was something that demanded a deeper, more contextual dive. I've never told you this, but I think when you were working at Charlotte Observer, not Observer, but magazine, with the Charlotte Teen of the Year award. I think I was driving through Bladen and almost drove off the road when y'all called me and told me that I had won that. But the thing that was interesting for me is being a transplant to North Carolina. I didn't know a whole lot about North Carolina outside of Charlotte, right? So I'd never been down east, as they say. I'd never been through the sand hills, and it's an interesting area because when we hear rural, right, we tend to think of a particular demographic, right? I'm just gonna be honest and say white, rural, low income. But the truth of the matter is, right, North Carolina has a really interesting history, right? And so rural can't just be a proxy for low income white, right? There are Black folk, rural folk down there. There are Lumbee, indigenous folk down there. And there's a lot of, wives' tales and a lot of stories and legends. How did y'all approach getting that really deeply local contextual flavor?
This is something you and I have talked about for years. So James was the Charlotte Teen of the Year in 2014, and he immediately was asked to do a lot of statewide work, travel around the state. And as soon as James started traveling to Eastern North Carolina, he would come back and we'd have lunch, and that's what we would talk about. We would talk about Eastern North Carolina. It's a different world from Charlotte. It's 2.5 hours east of here. Rivers and water defines life there. It's all flat. They flood, floods a lot. But the history of the place is so rich. It's the Black Second Congressional District that was represented by so many great Black politicians in the late 1800s before Jim Crow laws. It's the history, and you're right. If you drive along 95, the thought when you sit in Charlotte, you say rural, you think white guys,
right,
white people. But in Eastern North Carolina, it's far from that. It's just a rich, diverse place. And so, it was actually a James tweet that got me sort of, thinking about this one day. It was 2 weeks after this broke out. I had researched Eastern North Carolina a lot. I wanted to write a book called East of 95 my whole career because I love it out there. And I knew the history of the place, and I'd gathered all this stuff. I'd been in the Carolina room, I'd done so much research on Eastern North Carolina and just known about 1870, the Klan riding through these towns at night to try to get Governor William Holden out of office. All of these stories of how really the story of race and elections, so much of it played out in Eastern North Carolina. And so one random day, I'm scrolling through Twitter and James has tweeted, there's been so much great reporting done on this 9th district thing, but I haven't really seen anything that ties race to this. And I immediately took that as a challenge because I had all this stuff in notebooks, and I was like, I'm just going to write an essay tonight. And we published it about 2 days later on Charlotte Magazine site. And that essay is the formation of the second whole part of our book, was the foundation for the second whole part of our book.
Nick, we don't know each other very well, but that doesn't sound like me at all. I don't talk about race. I try to avoid the topic like crazy.
You almost said that with a straight face.
Couldn't make it through. But so you're kind of from the area, right?
Yeah.
And so if you don't mind, a little personal history. Can you go a little deeper, like into how you, trying to be the objective reporter, just could not resist and going in there and building in that localized flavor to this narrative?
Sure. Yeah. Well, and so the first thing I noticed when I get to Bladen County is race is still palpable in everything, and that racial tension is still palpable in everything. And I think it's important when we talk about, you can't talk about Bladen County, you certainly can't talk about Bladen County elections without talking about race. I mean, when you're talking to a white guy who says, oh, that black guy, he's a buddy of mine, same thing talking to a black person, oh, that white guy over there. And they don't think about it. It's not even always malicious. It's just how they talk and how they refer to one another. And in their political systems, there's a Black Political Action Committee, which we should talk about more, and we will tonight and get into, called the Bladen County Improvement Association. And then in 2018 and the years prior to that, there was the white organization, which was basically McCrae Dallas and the people who worked with him. And so there was even that racial tension there. And that struck me, I grew up in Hope Mills and Cumberland County, Fort Bragg, where we were, a melting pot, literally, because you got people from all over the world coming to be at Fort Bragg. Bragg. And so where I grew up, even though it was really close by, was not nearly as racially divided, because you had Fort Bragg, had the Army, had schools, it was it was different. And so when I got on the ground there, in December of 2018, that was one of the first things I noticed, is just how that permeated through everything. And you could already tell very quickly, and this is ultimately why we ended up writing this book, you could tell that what happened in the 9th Congressional District in 2018 wasn't a one-off event. It wasn't one dude working for one candidate who did this one thing one time. And so we really set out to tell the bigger story and the collision of all these forces that came together to unseat a guy who won a congressional election and didn't take a seat in Congress.
So in all seriousness, I gotta say, and I appreciate you referencing that tweet. I appreciate you all's willingness to not avoid the quote unquote elephant in the room, and saying that you can't afford not to talk about race, and do this story with any integrity. But I do want to go back to what you were talking about, and the vote, man. The best media is timely, right? And you all probably had no idea. This is prior to the sort of the big lie allegations and election fraud.
Trust me, we wanted to publish a year ago.
Keep going. But it's situated in a socio-political context now where the vote has always been sacred. It's always been important, but now the integrity of the vote is really, at the forefront. And democracy, the experiment, whatever modicum of democracy we're talking about, representative democracy, however that functions, is being contested. It's being argued, and some would argue it's in peril. Black political power, though, has always been a divisive thing, right? So when we say divisive, anything, it's been an area just itself, right? If it takes an amendment for you to be able to do it, it's obviously a divisive thing. But Reconstruction, era, that 12-year window, North Carolina, and all the wonderful leaders that were produced, and the resistance and the backlash to that, this feels like a story that really looks at the lineage of that and the modern manifestation. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
You're 100%. And the thing I'm most proud about in this book is that we draw a straight line from 1865, Reconstruction, North Carolina, and we go throughout history and we run you and we trace the dominoes from Reconstruction to what happened in 2018. Because again, it didn't happen in a vacuum. And I just talked about the Bladen County Improvement Association, a Black political action committee. Those formed in the middle of the 1900s. The Durham Committee on Negro Affairs, that was the first one that was created in the earlier 1900s in Durham. And that set the model for the rest of these political action committees, because it was formed so that Black people in Durham could get some power, not a lot of power, a little bit, like a seat right on the city council, the county commission, so that they could get better amenities at the bus station. And so it formed, they were successful, and that served as the model for these other organizations. In Bladen County, the Bladen County Improvement Association didn't come along until about the 80s. And they formed, and they had several strong Black leaders at the forefront. The strongest, a woman named Delilah Blanks, who's from Bladen County, who grew up in Bladen County, and we kind of chronicle that in the book, and went on to go get a PhD, went off to college, but came back home to educate people and to organize people. And so she was a teacher, an educator, and she was a political organizer, ended up being a county commissioner and a troublemaker for good or bad. I don't know if you know anything about that. And so you have this rich history there, and you have the rich history of McCrae Dallas and his folks, and you put it all together, and there's a lot to unpack. And we do that. Michael wrote all of part 2, and he did a great job fitting 150 years into 100 pages or so, and it moves, and it's really fascinating.
I don't know if you got me. He did an excellent job, man. Representing. I don't know if you got anything to add to that.
Well, there's all kinds of things you can add to the Durham Committee for Negro Affairs. Part of the reason, so let's connect it to Bladen County. Durham Committee for Negro Affairs is formed by C.C. Spalding, a guy named C.C. Spalding, who's from the infamous Spalding family, which has roots going back to 1780s in landowning being landowning people of color in North Carolina. So they were one of the first landowning people of color. They owned property in Bladen County, North Carolina, on the Columbus County line. C.C. Spalding's from that family. His one of his ancestors, or I can't remember if he was an uncle or cousin from, was George Henry White. George Henry White was the last Black congressman to stand on the floor of Congress before Jim Crow laws effectively eliminated Black representation in Congress in 1901 until 1928. So George Henry White was born in Bladen County, of all places. So here you have this central figure in American history. He's the Black congressman who stood on the floor of the House and said, our representation this might be the end of representation now. Phoenix-like, the Black man will rise again. The Black politician will rise again. He's from Bladen County, North Carolina. He left Bladen County, North Carolina, and started his own town in New Jersey, and said, "Make goddamn North Carolina the place of my birth," because he couldn't stand what North Carolina had done to election laws to effectively eliminate his power. So, or his ability to even hold office. He lost his office 2 years after Wilmington in 1898. All of his family was from that area. Bladen County, I still think, and I've said this many times in the course of talking about this book, if Wilmington in 1898 hadn't happened, I think Wilmington would be the biggest city in the South right now. And because what happened after Wilmington in 1898 is you had so much of the intellectual capital, the financial well-being of the city, or the financial prowess of the city. Anybody who was of any stature left and moved away from Wilmington. I mean, Wilmington just was set back economically by 1898 on top of all the other horrors of that event. So, I mean, and you're talking about just these very real connections, not just to the land, but actual descendants of the people who went through this still live there now. I mean, you're talking about, and still own land there. I mean, one of the people who helped us most with this book is a guy named Luke Alexander, who's the historian for the Spalding family. I mean, he still lives there with his mom. He's taking care of his mom, and just a brilliant guy. And he can point across the road. He says, "I've got relatives who are Lumbee living over there, and they never cross the road to come talk to us. And I've got relatives who are," and it's just a really interesting place. But it does go all the way back to that time, and you cannot separate it, because you're talking about generations and generations of wealth that left Eastern North Carolina, that left a place like Bladen County, just to the place it is today, where in 2010, I think they had 35,000 people, and today I think they have 30,000 people. So you're talking about a place that's losing population,
losing jobs,
being
flooded by hurricanes every 2 or 3 years, impacted by the opioid epidemic. You have to understand all of this to understand what happened in 2018. And unfortunately, it's not as simple as a headline on the evening news or in the newspaper. And might I suggest there's an entire book's worth of context here.
Take a moment to hear from our sponsor. But in all seriousness, I have a confessed bias, and that is that I am a historical thinker, right?
Yeah.
I am a educator, rabble rouser, I guess you could say. But seriously, for Black folks, the intersection of educator and activist, those things have always been wedded, because education has always been, as has the vote, one of the truest forms of freedom and liberation. And so the chasing after not only the ability to wield political power, but also literacy, right? And the way that has been wielded by folks like Governor Aycock to prevent folks from voting. There's a marriage between education and voting, right? In North Carolina specific, and that gets swept under the rug when folks like Governor Aycock get labeled the education governor, right?
Yeah.
Again, sort of looking at the unwillingness to confront those things. But also, I think that history is a hack, because if you know what has happened, you pretty much know what's going. And that was always the way that I looked at it. And so when I hear you talk about the foreshadowing and the ways that these things are just recycling themselves, the names have changed and maybe some of the characters, but for the most part, it's the same thing, right? So, the red shirts in their violent coup of the fusion government, right? This black and white government of folks that are coming together. And, you could argue that was a foreshadowing of the January 6th insurrection, except they had red hats instead of red shirts, right? And so all these things kind of work together. But I want to bring us to the fore. And we got about 10, 15 more minutes before we get ready to open up the questions. But talk to us about the modern manifestation of this. How did this scheme work? Talk to us about some of the players you think like just the most sensational. I mean, because again,
everyone,
right?
Everyone is sensational.
I mean, we can go with McCray Dallas, but the fact that the faith community, right? I mean, plays a role. I say this as a preacher, right?
Yeah, I was about to say, I watched you marry Mike.
I know.
And you keep knocking up the pictures.
Lemon has his picture. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, well, and it's important to understand first that in Bladen, there's evidence that people in Bladen County have been voting by absentee ballots with some shenanigans for a long time, not just Republicans, Democrats too. And that's just how people voted. Bladen County is huge. Is it 800 square miles by land mass? I mean, giant, right? And so largely rural. You scatter 30,000 people across 800 plus square miles. We don't got a lot of, still worse than NODAs, right? And so in order to get people to make sure they vote, people in Bladen County and surrounding counties have turned to using absentee ballots. And so that's before 2018, certainly in 2018 and 2016 and previous. One of the favorite things I talk about in literally every talk I do about the book is I bring up my colleague David Hodges at WBTV, who uncovered a complaint. Someone called the Bladen County Board of Elections and filed a complaint that someone from the Improvement Association didn't come by to pick up his ballot in that year's election.
Wow.
They complained because the ballot hadn't been picked up.
Like laundry, right? Because
that's just what they were used to. I think the person who complained was handicapped, had a home health aide, and they called because someone came by to get their ballot. It seems to not be legal. I'll just say that. And so this had been going on for a long time. And this is what people did, for illegal or otherwise,
sure,
rightly or wrongly. That's how they voted. And there was long suspicion of people going into nursing homes and taking advantage of elderly people in nursing homes. And that was a big contention in the 2010 election. We should say the 2010 election in Bladen County is probably is the dividing mark here between when things really get crazy, because in 2010 in Bladen County, for the first time, a black man was elected sheriff. Yes. He was elected sheriff. And it was probably the pinnacle of the Improvement Association, right? And Delilah Blanks and these political organizers who've been working since the 80s just to be able to get elected to the county commission, just one seat or two seats. And after suing, the DOJ and the Voting Rights Act, it was the pinnacle of Black power in rural North Carolina to have the sheriff. And after that, we saw a lot of, because in 2010, almost everyone was a Democrat. And so the real race was in the primary, right? Generally, really speaking. So it was a black candidate versus a white candidate, and all the Democrats, black and white, fought to see who would win the primary. And so it was after that election when we saw a lot of white people angry at a black sheriff getting elected, became Republicans. And that's that, because before that you had my daddy was a Democrat, my daddy's daddy was a Democrat, and he'd roll over in his grave if he knew that I were voting Republican, and the Jesse Crats, maybe I voted for Jesse Helms, but I'm still a registered Democrat. And so, it's into that from 2010 onward was really the clash and the tension between what became Republicans, McCray, and the Democrats led by the Improvement Association. And when I went down there on that very first day, on my and I told my boss, I'm going, don't know what I'm gonna come up with. I ended up, the very first place I went in Bladen County was McCray Dallas's kitchen. and I was meeting with McCray and another political guy and the chairman of the county commission, a guy named Ray Britt. And I sit down. I mean, it's a pretty big deal to be in McCray Dallas's kitchen in early December of 2018. This guy that everyone across the world wants to talk to. Here I am. And so I pulled up in his driveway, And I said to him, I shook his hand and I said, I don't know what you have or haven't done, but I know you're not the only person who's done it. And that has proven, and you read in the book, proven to be true. But he looks at me and he goes, wait till you see what I have here. He's tapping his shirt pocket. And so I'm like, holy cow, I'm talking to McCrae. He's got a secret note in his pocket. This is going to be amazing. I got 2 other dudes. Don't know who you are, but this is going to be great. And so we go into his house. He I think is not smoking anymore, but was a prolific smoker up until very recently, including in his house. So I'm sitting in this very smoky wood paneled kitchen at his table. It's got little snowman tablecloth on it, and so we're sitting down, and I'm just like, all right, this is gonna be good. Let's see, I'm gonna have this exclusive tonight. And the county commissioner, Ray Britt, just starts talking about some suspect nursing home ballots that they think the Bladen County Improvement Association got in the 2010 election for sheriff. And I'm like, yo, this is not why I'm here. But that for them was still what they were fighting over. And what happened in 2018 in the 9th Congressional District didn't really have anything to do with Mark Harris.
Wow.
It didn't really have anything to do with Dan McCready. It really had to do with this fight between McCrae and the Improvement Association, Republicans and Democrats, white people and black people wanting the power. And it just so happened that year, the fight happened to include a seat in Congress.
It was a proxy war,
Yeah.
right? That it had the 10-year time delay.
Well, things take a little longer to get to Bladen County.
Yeah, to be fair.
Yeah.
So what about you with regard to like the interesting characteristics and like the most sensational pieces of this story? What are the things that jump out for you, man?
Besides the history stuff, I mean, I think there's several people, and I found in the history section that I could write a whole nother book about, honestly. But I mean, Nick and I were driving out to meet McCrae for the first time for me in August 2019. And we kind of talked about, all right, let's talk about how we make this, let's set this up right from the get-go. I'm not talking to that man unless I have a recorder on, and he needs to know that. Just to cover our bases here. And we show up, I turn the recorder on, and he just kind of stares at it and doesn't say anything. And then we talked for a little bit, and then we left, and he called Nick, and he was like, I don't know if I trust Mike. He's got that recorder, and he's just like, so it took me a long time to even get him to speak to me. Like, he didn't want to talk to me, but at every turn, we would just find out some crazy stuff. Like the McCrae's lawyer, we go to meet with her. She's in this old Southern rural office, and she's got a globe in the corner. And I said, "What's in that globe?" And she says, "Liquor." And she opens it up, and it's like that liquor.
To be more accurate, she said, "Liquor. You want a drink?"
Yeah.
Really better hospitality.
Yeah. And she was just sizing me up like everybody else was in that area, and just sizing me up. And she said, "You're like John Cusack in Midnight of the Garden and Good and Evil." And I said, "Excuse me?" And then she handed me a DVD and told me to go home and watch it again. And I said, "All right." So I did. Of course, the idea is that John, it's like in the book, John, the reporter from outside comes to town and is sort of proxy to a murder, and it gets caught up in this crazy Southern story about like murder and wealth and things like that.
Nothing says we're glad to have you like that.
And I was like,
I
what does that
underestimated.
mean?
That was kind of poetic. That was kind of smooth.
I know, and I was like, what are you saying? Like, what am I going to witness here in the course of writing this book? So just stuff like that would happen all the time. I mean, McCrae Dallas would go, he'd have these big court hearings where all the reporters in North Carolina were there, and they would be waiting for him to say something, big or something, and he wouldn't say anything. He'd walk out, he'd walk past them, not say a word. And then Nick would call me, and I'd watch this happen, on Twitter, on TV or something. And Nick would call me like 20 minutes later and say, "McCrae just called me." It's like, "He just called you? Like, what?" And he said he was in a parking lot of a Chick-fil-A smoking a cigarette and having some sweet tea. And I was like, what? And I was like, could you write? And so what we did throughout the course of the book was I said, send me an email with everything that man said to you,
I mean,
so that we didn't lose any of it.
the crazy, maybe one of the craziest, every story in the book's crazy. Like I said when we started, I'm a TV reporter. I don't know a thing about writing a book, but I was sitting in McRae's kitchen a different day in December of 2018, and something had happened. I don't know what it was, but I remember saying, this is so crazy. Someone's going to write a book about it, and maybe it ought to be me. And I think I went home that weekend back to Charlotte and started Googling, how did you write a book? That's how all great books start. But you flash forward to February after the hearing where the ninth district race is thrown out. Very end of February, McRae's arrested, and that story, it's in the book in great detail, and it is nuts. 45 minutes before McRae Dallas is arrested by agents with the State Bureau of Investigation, he calls me up, and I talked to him. I said, what are you doing, man? And he said, I'm having me a glass of tea, sitting out at his buddy's barbecue restaurant. And I said to him, if I were you, I mean, the whole weight of the world still, they just threw the election out. Everyone's waiting for him to be indicted and arrested, and I said, so he said he's having a glass of tea. And I said to him, if I were you, I'd probably need a little stronger brown liquid in that glass. I'm a bourbon guy. We would joke about that. He laughed, and we talked for another minute or two, and we hung up. And less than an hour later, his lawyer, Cindy Singletary, is calling me, telling me McRae had been arrested. And we got the criminal discovery file for McRae's case. And in there is a minute by minute account of the State Bureau of Investigation agents that were there that day, that's fanned out across the metropolis of Bladenboro to go get McRae Dallas. And it reads like exactly what you would think a small town crime drama. I mean, they met, they set up in the Hardee's parking lot. Someone went to the Dollar Tree next door. It was like, what do you?
It's like the Bladen County version of like the final scene of Scarface or something. Except the sweet tea.
Sweet tea. And I actually talked to him. I talked to him on Monday. He was in court on these charges that he was arrested on this day we're talking about, actually. And he called me from the car on his way home on Monday, and I said, "You gonna get you a Pepsi when you get home?" He said, "I'm drinking a sweet tea right now."
That's what it is.
So
yeah, brand loyalty.
Oh, he likes Pepsi too, just so we're clear.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
North Carolina bread. You got to keep it North Carolina.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, we got about 15 minutes here, and so we want to be able to open up a few questions for those folks who are in the audience. And
Let's
so,
see if James can open the Q&A box here.
oh, right. So one of the questions is, how did Nick's access to dollars come about? He didn't talk to anyone else. That was such a get. You got into that a little bit, but you want to go?
Yeah. The story's even. Yeah. So, and Gene, that's a great question. So like I said, I'm from Hope Mills, the closest point to Bladen County, right, in a city of more than 100,000 people, right? And so I grew up there, and we had some family friends who were kind of involved in the local political scene growing up, and they're still good friends of ours. And so when I decided, well, crap, I can't do anything else. I need to go to Bladen County. I don't know anyone in Bladen County, so let's try to get some people. So I called this old family friend who'd been involved in politics for a long time. And he said, oh, call this other guy who I had kind of known just because he was friends with his family friend. Call this other guy who's really involved in politics in Bladen County. And it was late at night because I decided trying to set up for the next day, and he was already asleep. And so my phone rang at like 5 a.m. I was not awake at 5 a.m. the next morning. And he called again at like 6:30 in the morning. I was like, all right, I guess I better answer this time. And so he says, yeah, I'll help you out. Call this other guy. This other guy is, Bladen County, and he knows everything, and he knows McRae, and he was real tight with McRae. So call this guy. So at this point, we're at friend of a friend of a friend, those keeping track at home. And so I get on the phone with that guy, and I talked to him for probably an hour. I remember I talked to him putting gas in my car. I talked to him in the car getting on 40. I talked to him on 95. And I kind of tell him who I am, my background, how I know these people, I get them, and how I understand that there's been rumors of these things in that part of the world for a long time, and we've only heard one side of the story. And eventually, I say to him, look, this is what I want to do. Do you think McRae Dallas would be willing to talk to me? Because we haven't heard from him yet. I mean, and that's the objective of any reporter, is to get at least a second side of the story.
Right.
Normally there's more than two sides, but we want at least another side, right?
Right.
Especially a side that no one else had heard from yet. And he says, he's probably not going to talk to you, but I'll call him and I'll see. And so, okay, I'm still driving away. I'm like, I hope this works out because I got nothing else. I don't even know where I'm going to start, but let's go. And so he calls back 20 minutes later. He says, here's McCrae's number. He's expecting your call. And I'm like, all right, jackpot. This is good. Let's work the magic here. And so I call McCrae and I talk to McCrae for a minute or two. And he says, really early in the conversation, before we've even really talked, he says, well, you coming to the house, ain't you?
Wow.
And I'm like, well, yeah, I'm coming to the house. I mean,
I'm on my way right now.
Literally. I'm about 30 minutes out. I'll be right upstairs. And I actually remember distinctly, I had to take some road and the road was being repaved. And so, they got the dude with the stop sign there telling you to stop because you can't go because it's one lane. And I hit that and I'm sitting there for like 4 or 5 minutes. And I'm like, y'all do not understand.
You do not turn the sign around.
I got a big interview sitting on the other side there. And so I pulled up in his driveway and I'd already talked, I'd shake his hand, said what I said, we go inside. And it was interesting to me. I mean, he had this folded up sheet of paper that turned out to be the story I did that day, which was evidence of a third guy taking notes that contemplated paying people for ballots. And it was interesting though, he'd been saving that for something. I don't know what, and I don't know why he heard, oh, this guy's coming, so I'm gonna put it in my pocket and talk to him about it. But I think McCrae and his folks were all intrigued by the fact that here's for all intents and purposes, local boy. I mean, I'm definitely more local than the dudes coming from London and New York and DC. And even though I live in Charlotte, when I start talking in Bladen County, my twang comes out a little bit.
It's code switch.
It's not. I didn't even mean it. It's not even purposeful. It just happens, right? And so I can get along with them a little bit, talk like them a little bit, and I think they've always been comfortable talking to me, and they understand and believe that I was truly interested in telling more than what had been out at that point. And I still am. It's important to find that. Yeah.
Wow. That's an awesome build up, and it's hard not to be enthralled by the character of McCrae Dowdis, right? I mean, dude's kind of a larger than life personality. But I always thought what was interesting was the economic angle of this, right? Like you mentioned, you look at a heat map, that area on anything, like jobs, birth to death, that area when it came to like broadband, even like during the pandemic, right? That area is really struggling. There wasn't a whole lot of money being exchanged for these ballots in the grand scheme, right? Like we're not talking about like casino type.
It is in Bladen County.
Levels of cash being exchanged here. And so I thought about like the economic incentive. I'm like, well, we're not even talking about a whole lot of money for folks to be engaging in this.
But it's a lot of money to them. I mean, that's the thing. It's not a lot. I mean, so I think he was paying $10 a ballot request form or something like that. It would fluctuate based on the person. But if you got 10 of them in a day, you made $100. And in Bladen County, that was pretty good day's work at the time, and still is. And that's the fear. I mean, that's the scary thing that I think is, we had a fun time telling this story, but the scary thing is political campaigns are getting richer and people in Bladen County are not getting any richer. So these opportunities are still there. And that's why we talked about, we had to go back and unpack the entire history of the place and to show like, how did a place become desperate? Who's desperate and why? And what do they need to survive? And so in a lot of these folks' cases, getting a few ballots, and sadly, in some of the cases, it was helping them maintain a habit, an opioid addiction, and that's the saddest part of the story. Is as it trickled down, a lot of the folks closer to the ground are the ones who were indicted in this, and the people who passed the money down from the top. But
isn't that how it happens, though? I mean, isn't that American commentary right there? And how things operate in the United States is, there's an incentive there. Right. Yeah. There's always economic incentive. Folks don't commit crime for fun most times. They do it out of necessity. Yeah. There's a question directed for you there in the Q&A, and it's Michael, how was the process of collaborating on the writing of this book different from your other writing? Because you do a lot of writing, man. For folks who don't know, Mike's a beautiful writer, and but this is different. It's a book, man.
Yeah. I was working on another project. I had written a book proposal, had sent the first draft to the agent. He sent it back. As I was working on revising it, this happened. And I had a friend, an editor friend, read that first proposal on that first book idea. And it was right after I'd written that essay for Charlotte Magazine on the connection between race and Bladen County. And my friend, the former editor of the News and Observer, said, "This is the book you should be writing." And
Somebody ought to write a book one day.
and I sort of sat on that. It was the same year my dad died. So my dad passed away that January. I didn't think about anything. I certainly didn't think about Bladen County for a while. About 2 months later is when this opportunity came with Nick. It was beautiful because a lot of the stuff that Nick does, a lot of folks know I call him the Ox. His last name is Ochsner. You call him the Ox because he'll just bust through doors and chase people around with cameras and stuff like that. Stuff that I would never do. And I admire him for it. I admire him for having the guts to go chase to sort of seek the truth in people by putting, and it's uncomfortable because sometimes he does it to friends of my people that I know. Mm-hmm. But he's got this way of going about getting information from people and getting people to tell him things and getting people to agree to the interview. And then when I get to jump into the interview, I have a way of getting them to just sort of spill their entire life story. I just want to, I just sit there and listen. I'll just wait you out until you tell the whole story. And we can circle back around. So it was a beautiful thing because Nick came to me and he had hundreds of pages of discovery files before I even started writing the book. And the discovery files had phone records, which for a narrative nonfiction writer like myself, phone records all come with timestamps. So I could make a timeline of our whole book based on when McCrae Dallas was making calls to Mark Harris and things like that. I could do all this stuff. And so I was creating an outline of our book through the timestamps that we were finding in some of these calls. And so, part of the build up to writing the book was I created an entire timeline of a lot of the events that we had and was trying to go back and plug them in and things like that. And it was a big timeline from 1865 to 2018. I'll say that. It kept growing on me, but I did kind of what I normally do. Nick had a lot of the reporting, and Nick also wrote the framework essentially for the first and third parts of this book. The second part is all history. The first and third parts, I was working on the second part, and Nick kind of framed up the house on the first part, and I came in behind him and just was like, we have to go back and ask these questions and add these details and things like that.
Yeah, Michael is a beautiful writer. If you've never read any of his writing, you should, but he's really good. And so it was a treat for me and a privilege to be able to work with someone like Michael, who is just, fantastic and is observant and thoughtful and he's all the things that I'm not. And likewise, I can do the things that he can't. So between the two of us, we can really write a mean book.
Clearly, no, that's been demonstrated. And I can't wait to dig into it. As I said, UNC Press, not too shabby. You know what I mean?
We're pretty pleased.
Wonderful reviews written. I do want to know from Michael and Nick, as you guys are kind of doing a lot of these talks, you're probably absorbing, this virtue having left your body to create this piece of work. But I feel like the best contributions kind of have an overriding theme. And so if you were, what kind of commentary, right? So I'll situate it saying this. In the classroom, I always felt like, whenever I would teach the students that there was a lesson or a moral to be gained, right? Nothing like the universe conspires. You all have to felt like you were part of something larger than yourself that ushered you all together, that brought about this book and then contextualized it in this social political environment. So if there was anything you would offer to the readers out there, as we kind of approach our closing minutes here, what do you think that it is? What do you think the commentary is that's hidden in this book for citizens of North Carolina, certainly, but of the United States?
I'll say it's hidden, but actually Marion just put in a comment that I think hits it right on the head. Is this book is about people who had largely been ignored and forgotten. And 2018, the scandal of the 9th District in 2018 is the result of a bunch of people being ignored and forgotten. And so this is what happens to those people. This is what happens when systems fail that are supposed to, for instance, keep our elections in check and investigate elections fraud, right? And we knew there had been rumors of these shenanigans, no one had ever dug in. And so people are particularly vulnerable in places like Bladen County in Eastern North Carolina, and they need our attention just as much as places like Charlotte do. And when they don't get that attention, things like the 2018 election scandal burst wide open and they become a news story for 10 minutes, and maybe someone will write a book about it, and then people go on back about their lives.
I mean, yeah, we turned the book in, we turned the draft of the book in, the first draft in September 2020. This was 2 months before the election, 4 months before what happened on January 6th. And Nick has just reread the book like out loud for the audio version. And he was telling me, he's just like, do you know how much of our book like foreshadowed what happened on January 6th, basically, like what's happening now? And I can say that when January 6th happened, and we had finished the book and we were like kind of working on an epilogue, and I was sitting there in tears, just like watching this happen. And part of it was because we have all these lessons from the past. We should have known this. And part of it was, our book is a story about poverty too. It's largely a story about poverty and desperation. And poverty isn't only there when you see, I wrote about the homeless encampment called Tent City last year. I wrote a big story about that, camped out there for 10 days. Poverty isn't just Tent City. Like the effects of poverty come out in elections like this, where desperation just rules. And it comes out because people don't trust the system. And you can say globally, people don't trust the system. I stood in the grocery store parking lot the first day I got to Bladen County and I just asked as many people as I could, white, black, whoever, what do you think about what's going on? And they all said the same thing. What are you doing here now? Where you been? And it's all crooked. I'll never forget this woman named Fanny, a black woman whose home had just flooded out in Hurricane Florence that year. And she's just like, of course it's crooked. Of course, why are y'all here now? Of course, you're just focusing on that one guy. The sheriff's office is crooked. The hog plant is crooked. Like the hog slaughtering operation is crooked. Like all of it is crooked. Well, that's trust. Like that is what happens when desperation reigns. Is trust erodes. And when trust erodes, you have events like January 6th happen. When you have people who are willing to spread falsehoods, and the truth is our book does show that there are problems with our elections.
Yeah.
Like we have problems with our elections. But our book also shows we need to focus on the real problems with our elections and not make up ones, because we don't need to make up problems. We already got our problems.
Yeah.
Like we don't need to come up with false problems, because we have some that we need to actually look at, like the things that are in our book. So I hope what happens is, and it's the same thing I do with most of my stories. I hope that we just pay attention to the folks who are a little bit more desperate than us, whether they live in Charlotte, or whether they live in Bladen County. Because the more folks fall away, the more folks are separated from the reality of this experiment, democracy, the more folks are separated from it.
Yeah.
The more this is going to happen. One of the original titles of the only original title of our book before it was changed to The Vote Collectors was Rotten. The book was going to be called Rotten.
Wow.
And the whole idea was, and we use the word rotten in the book, because a guy told me politics is rotten in this area anyway. And I just thought rot spreads unless you do something about it. And so this is a chance, these areas can't keep falling away. We have to pay attention to them.
That's particularly powerful and potent stuff. And I want to congratulate you all for this contribution to the social political canon in North Carolina, but I also appreciate you for exposing that rot, right? And shining a light on the people who have been hidden, right? And stopping the erosion of despair, right? So that hopefully the foundation can be restored.
Yeah.
Maybe we can build something on top of it, maybe.
Hope so.
I hope so as well.
Bladen County was called the Mother County. Its nickname was the Mother County because it's used to spread from the eastern North Carolina all the way to the mountains. And Mecklenburg was part of Bladen County in the 1700s. So I'll never, that's the Mother County. I mean, you coming on like that's why we say like this could spread elsewhere. That's why we say it.
Or it could be fixed if people read the book and take action, right? There's
Right.
two choices. One's going to happen. People are either going to take action to address what happened in Bladen County in 2018, or they're not, and it's going to happen again. It's not just going to happen in Bladen County. This could happen all over the state and all over the country.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's okay.
Yeah, I know that's uplifting.
No.
Please buy the book.
On that note, we're all gonna die. No, just kidding. But in all seriousness, this is a guide for change, right? When people know better, hopefully they do better, and we want to try to put that theory to the test. And so, the vote collectors. This has been a wonderful conversation with Michael Graff and Nick Ochsner, not Nick Ochsner, otherwise known as the Ox. And so I believe that's our time. I want to thank everybody for tuning in, and we'll hand it back over to you, Hop. Is that all right? That's pretty good.
That's good.
Thanks, guys. That was absolutely amazing. And I love your end comment, James. If we know better, we can do better. Let's hope so. The Vote Collectors, incredible book. Signed copies at Park Road Books. Everybody needs to read it. If you have any questions, just give us a call at the store or email, or Nick and Mike can help you out, I'm sure. Thank you all for attending and for your wonderful questions and participating in this great conversation. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, James. Thank you, Mike. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Pleasure.